Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to What I Know Now. This is episode 20, I Love Music Part 2. As I said in the last episode, I have loved music for as long as I can remember, at least since I was 4 or 5. I talked last episode about the 70s and how I got into Motown and adult contemporary. And this episode, I'm going to move into the 1980s because that's when I really came of age, both as a person moving into my teens and also as a music lover. I began to develop my own taste in music, sort of independent from my parents' influence. And I got into a lot of different types of music. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I am a child of the 70s. I was born in 1970, but I really am the culmination of the 1980s. The 80s was such a fun and eclectic decade for music. I think for most people, if you say 80s music, they think of one of two things. They think of, in the beginning of the decade, the new wave, i.e., the new romantics, that type of music, or they think of towards the end of the decade of heavy metal and the beginnings of grunge. But the truth is, there were all types of music in the 80s. There was still stadium rock, which was super popular, which are sort of your Journeys and your Queens and your Foreigners, those type of bands. There was alternative rock beginning to really leave its mark with bands like the Smiths and Depeche Mode and REM. And you still had some adult contemporary. And the other type of music that was super popular was dance music. So people like Cheryl Lynn, Crystal Waters, Shalimar, who I loved Shalimar with Jody Watley, and then Jody Watley herself when she later became a solo artist. Madonna. You can't think of the 80s and dance music without thinking of Madonna. So there were several variations of music in the 80s, and people just sort of get stuck on new wave or heavy metal. I was a very heavy new wave girl. Once I discovered new wave, there was no changing that. There was no going back. In the 80s, people called it the second British invasion because so many of the bands from that era were British. Culture Club, Duran Duran, Style Council, Level 42, The Human League, The Rhythmics. All those bands were British. Pet Shop Boys, Howard Jones. So a lot of people looked at the early 80s both in the sense of the new wave and the second British invasion. So we had the first one in the 1960s, and the second one came in the 1980s. Those bands and their sound really dominated the early 80s charts. The first band that I saw live when I was 10, I believe, maybe 11, was Duran Duran. And that was the time of Planet Earth and Careless Memories and the album Rio, which came out in 1982, I believe. Just turned 42 years old, which is so hard for me to wrap my brain around. But that was one of the first albums I ever bought on vinyl. So that was my first concert. My best friend and her mom was our chaperone, took us to the show at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. And it was just such a fantastic evening. That was from my first show was when I really fell in love with concerts and going to live music. I enjoy listening to albums, to music on tape or on CD or vinyl or whatever the medium is, but I really do love to experience music in a live setting. For me, there is nothing that compares to that. I've seen some bands more than others. After being a fan for nearly 40 years, I just saw Culture Club and Boy George last summer, and the show was amazing. Even after all these years, they still sound really great. So that was really the beginning of my independent love of music, I will say. As I moved into high school, I got further into new wave music, the Smiths, The Cure, Depeche Mode, bands like that. And for my parents, it was kind of a huge mood shift. I went from listening to Motown and listening to adult contemporary things like Anne Murray and Christopher Cross and Elton John. And I had moved into this whole different phase. My mother viewed it kind of as my dark period. That's what she called it. Because I went through that phase that most teenagers go through when you decide like black is your it color and that's what you're going to wear. So I wore a ton of black. And as I've said before, I went to a private all girls high school, and since it was Catholic, we had to wear these ugly brown polyester uniforms, which were totally hideous. So on the weekend, when I got to be myself and wear my own clothes, I sort of vacillated between the look that was popular at the time. If you think like Madonna or Frankie Goes to Hollywood, like everybody had those shirts that said relax. I had those. I had fingerless gloves. I had neon everything. I think the ugliest thing I owned in the 80s was something that those of us who lived through it call lifesaver leg warmers. And if you put that into a Google search engine, you'll see just how ugly those are. If you've never seen them, the reason they're called that is if you take a roll of lifesavers and they look like red, yellow, green, blue, I think is the color now. Red, yellow, green. It repeats that way. That's exactly what those leg warmers look like, except it was horizontal. So they made your legs look thicker. They were loud. They were hideous. But me and practically everybody I knew had at least one pair of those. So I vacillated between that look and then just like wearing all black with like bright sneakers. I had yellow sneakers, I had pink sneakers, I had this whole closet of really loud, obnoxious sneakers. So it was either all black and loud sneakers or like neon everything with the Madonna like bow in my hair, all that. So I really do think my mother, as a good Christian woman, did a lot of praying back then. Just hoped that I would make it through my teens, and for her, she would make it through my teens because she just did not understand the look, the music. She didn't understand any of it. So it was just pretty funny to me. It was funny to me at the time. And as I look back on it, yeah, it's still funny. So as I got into high school, the cliques of my high school, yes, all girls schools do have cliques too. Musically, there were sort of three main groups. There were the new wave girls, which I was in that group, obviously. There were the hard rock slash heavy metal girls, and then there were the R&B sort of new jack swing girls, girls who were into New Edition, Belle Biv DeVoe, Blackstreet, bands like that. So we were all super different that way. I'd say most of the girls, I'd say probably half of them were metal girls or stadium rock kind of girls, girls who were really into Journey, Aerosmith, Queen, Boston, Kansas, bands like that. And so for the other 50% of us, we were probably split 50-50 between the new wave girls and the R&B girls. People who know me and know my musical taste will ask me what it was like in the 80s being someone who was into that kind of music. What I will say about that is it was not always an easy place to be because, like I said, my parents didn't really get it. Some of my friends who were into other types of music really didn't get it. And some of my black friends kind of felt like I was, I don't know, betrayal is too strong a word, but that I was not being faithful to Black music and what Black music was and what it represented. And I'm not so sure I really understood what they were saying when I was, 14, 15, because my attitude was, look, I like what I like. Black, white, whoever made it, this is what I like. So there was a lot of that when I was a teenager. I think kids today have more of an opportunity to like what they like, and people don't feel the need to put them in a box. As a Gen X person, I think our parents, especially, some of our parents were boomers, as I've said several times. My parents are silent generation, so they're the generation before the boomers. I think our parents felt like, okay, yes, we fought for you to have the freedom you have to be who you are and like what you like and all that type of thing. But I still think they kind of felt like, what are you doing? Like, what are you listening to? So there was some of that, absolutely. In terms of what the music meant to me, being a new wave person, I remember very clearly the very first time I saw Culture Club on television and I saw Boy George, and I was absolutely amazed and fascinated by the fact that he was so open and so clear about who he was. And I watched him being interviewed, and the interviewer said, why do you go by this moniker? Why do you go by Boy George? And he said, well, George is my given name. My name is George O'Dowd. I started calling myself Boy George because people would look at me with the hair and the makeup and the clothes, and they'd be confused as if I were a boy or a girl. So I always wanted to make it clear that I am a boy. And it's very interesting to me from a historical perspective in terms of what the 80s was. Those of us who lived through it look back on the decade as, like, musically a very open decade. There were all kinds of sounds, there was all kinds of music, and people could be who they were. But on the one end, you had Boy George, and then on the other end, you had people like Elton John, like Freddie Mercury, like George Michael. People who did not feel comfortable coming out into the world, both for personal reasons and also they feared it would affect their career. George Michael, especially, had a reputation as a sex symbol, as a hot guy, as a guy that women wanted. And so he had a lot of fear that coming out and saying he was gay would destroy his career. I think about that from a modern perspective and think about just how sad that was and how lonely that had to have been to live with knowing who you were, but being afraid to express that to the world. So the 80s was a super interesting decade that way. You had people who were out and proud and comfortable, and people who were terrified that they would be outed. So that was super interesting. Another dynamic that was interesting in the 80s was we'll call it the come up of women in music. Women like Pat Benatar, women like Stevie Nicks, women like Jody Watley and Madonna. It was and always had been an old boys club. Women were either in groups like the Supremes, the Marvelettes, the Ronettes, groups like that, or they were backup singers. So a lot of the old boys club was not super comfortable when the ladies stepped up to the mic and started taking charge. That's also important in the beginnings of hip hop. When you think about the beginnings of hip hop and the women who stepped into the game as solo artists, MC Lyte, Queen Latifah, Roxanne Shante, Yo Yo. When you think about ladies like that who said, this has always been an old boys club, but we're going to show you how the ladies do it, a lot of people were not ready for that. I hear a lot of discussions now about women in rap and do we want our daughters to emulate women like Cardi B or Sexy Red, or is that something we want to keep our daughters away from? Those same conversations were going on in the 1980s. Parents were completely freaked out by Salt and Pepper because they were super real and super honest. TLC, same thing. And people were asking those questions back then of, is this a message we want our daughters to have or not? So it was a super interesting time. I look back at that and look at what's going on now. And what always comes to mind is there's a saying that goes, history repeats itself because nobody listened the first time. Yeah, that's what it feels like when I hear some of the conversations that people have. Some of the bands and artists that I was really into back in the 80s, Blondie. Blondie was super interesting from the perspective of they sort of threw it all in there and watched what came out. So they were post punk, they were post disco, but they were also the first white band to feature a rap artist. If you listen to the Blondie song Rapture, at the end of that song is Grandmaster Flash singing with Debbie Harry. So they were way ahead of their time from that point of view, and their music was just super cool and interesting. So I really liked Blondie. New Order, which is kind of, I won't say they're the opposite of Blondie, but they're just very different. Most people that know that New Order was an outgrowth from a band called Joy Division. Joy Division was a very serious post-punk music that made you think. The one Joy Division song that everybody knows is Love Will Tear Us Apart. And on the brink of their sort of big success and stardom, their lead singer, who was also their primary songwriter, Ian Curtis, committed suicide. And so the remaining members of the band wanted to continue to be a band, but they knew they could not be Joy Division. So they changed their name and really totally changed their style and became New Order. Blue Monday and Bizarre Love Triangle are usually the New Order songs that people know. New Order is a kind of band where their songs were borrowed and dubbed and changed and featured in other songs. So even if you don't think you know any New Order songs, I can pretty much guarantee you that you do. On the heavier side of music, I really loved The Police. The Police were a band that was never meant to last. The Police were only together 7 or 8 years, I believe. And I say that because there was always a lot of tension in that band between the three members. There have been conversations over the years about whether they really liked each other or whether they really couldn't stand each other. And I think the jury's still out. But the music they made in that brief time was so electric and really bridged the gap between the post-punk movement and the stadium rock music. Songs like Roxanne, Every Breath You Take, a couple other songs that are escaping my brain right now. But if you want to listen to some like cool 80s rock, look up the Police album Synchronicity. That's the album they're most known for. It's just really cool. I also really got into the Cars. Now, people, when they think of the Cars nowadays, they think of like the Magic era and the You Might Think era. But if you go back in the Cars catalog, say that quickly, from the late 70s, early 80s, you get songs like My Best Friend's Girl, Since You're Gone. You just get a different vibe. So the Cars sort of became a pop band because they became so popular, but they're another super interesting early 80s rock band. In terms of British invasion rock, Squeeze. Squeeze is one of those bands that really took the temperature of the room and understood what people liked and what people wanted to hear. Squeeze wasn't always mainstream. It was not always like, ooh, here's the latest pop thing. Squeeze was always a bit off the beaten path. The one Squeeze song everybody knows is called Tempted, and it's been used in tons of TV shows, movie soundtracks. It's one of those songs that never dies. But if you dive into Squeeze's catalog, you're going to hear songs that are very different. Breakfast in Bed, Black Coffee. you're going to hear different things. If you want to investigate Squeeze, East Side Story is the album I would recommend. In terms of stadium rock and sort of mainstream rock, I did a little of that. The two bands I would say I enjoyed the most from that genre were Journey, because Steve Perry had this voice of an angel that just rose and took over all the instrumentation from their songs, like Separate Ways, Faithfully, Lovin', Touchin', Squeezin'. I mean, you hear a master at work when you hear Steve Perry. The other band from that genre that I really loved, have seen several times, and am sad to see that they're now having serious personal issues, is Hall & Oates. Hall & Oates, again, is one of those bands that people think of like, oh, we know all these pop songs, Family Man and all those sorts of songs. But if you dig back into the 70s of Hall & Oates, when you get songs like Sarah's Smile and my all-time favorite Hall & Oates song, She's Gone, it's just an amazing combination of lyrics and songwriting and musicality. Hall & Oates will always be in my top 5. When it got more into the new wave scene, new wave is almost exclusively British Invasion from that time for me. I've mentioned Culture Club and Duran Duran. I really got into the Style Council. Paul Weller is the singer and creator behind the Style Council. My Ever Changing Moods is one of my favorite songs. Level 42 is another band. Now, they were probably more popular in their native England than they ever became in the United States. But Level 42, Leaving Me Now, Running in the Family, there are just some really great Level 42 songs. The Psychedelic Furs. The Psychedelic Furs became well known in America for a song from a John Hughes movie. The movie was Pretty in Pink with Molly Ringwald, and they became popular for the theme song from that movie. So the song is called Pretty in Pink. The Psychedelic Furs, I think, were affected by the fact that that song became so popular. It was played all year that it came out. And that's what everybody got in their heads that the Psychedelic Furs sounded like. So when people would go to see them live and they would get this totally different, the Psychedelic Furs vibe is moody and thoughtful and dark, I guess is a good word. And so everybody is expecting this poppy, like Pretty in Pink set. And that's literally the only song they have that's like that. So I think the Psychedelic Furs really confused people, but they were a really cool band. I saw them a couple of years ago. They're still a tight band, so I think they were really good. The Human League. The Human League is a band I would put in the same category as the Psychedelic Furs. The Human League song everybody knows is Don't You Want Me? Everybody knows that song. But people would go to shows and expect to hear a bunch of songs like that, and that is not what the Human League sounds like. If you listen to Keep Feeling Fascination or Mirror Man or Human, those songs have very different vibes than Don't You Want Me. One of the most popular bands that came out of the new wave era is the Eurythmics. Sweet Dreams Are Made of This was their first single. It is still the song that everybody knows from them. The minute you hear it, you hear the beginning of the song, you know what the song is. But they have a whole catalog of really great songs. Thorn in My Side, Missionary Man, When Tomorrow Comes. There are tons of Eurythmics songs that are really great, but they do not sound anything like Sweet Dreams. When I got to college, I was able to sort of slide in and out of groups of people more easily than I was in high school. And I got to hear people listening to music that I likely otherwise would have never heard. And from that, I was able to get into bands that I am grateful that I got into, but that I probably never would have heard. I think on the top of that list would be the Pet Shop Boys. I am a huge Pet Shop Boys fan. Saw them for the first time a couple of years ago. Even 40 years after their debut, they are just so interesting and so unusual. They can go from happy and peppy to moody and disinterested or perky. They just have a huge range of song emotions in their catalog. West End Girls, again, like the Eurythmics for the Pet Shop Boys, West End Girls was their first song. It is the song they are most famous for, but after 40 years, they have a huge discography, say that quickly, of songs to listen to. So if you're interested in the Pet Shop Boys, dig into their discography. These next two bands, one is the outgrowth of another, so I'm going to put them together. In England, they were just called The Beat. In America, they were called the English Beat. So the English Beat slash General Public, because General Public grew out of the English Beat. General Public's primary members were Dave Wakeling and Rankin Roger. And Rankin Roger became known for his ability to ska, not scat, not a jazz thing, but to put a ska spin on records. So if you listen to songs like Sooner or Later or Never You Done That or their remake of the Staple Singers' I'll Take You There, you always know a beat song or a General Public song because Rankin Rogers' voice was that distinct and that unusual. So those are good bands to check out. The other band that I'd put up at the top of the list with the Pet Shop Boys of bands I got into in college would be the B-52s. The B-52s are incredibly hard to describe musically. They just whatever was hot and interesting and party focused. The B-52s were known as the world's greatest party band. And their songs really were the kinds of things that would get people out on the dance floor. Love Shack is the B-52 song that everybody knows. It was not their first single, but that's the song that everybody knows. But there are so many others. Good Stuff, not Space Age Love Song. There's a space song in there. Your Own Private Idaho. And they all have a very distinct sound, like with Rankin Roger and General Public and The Beat. You know a B-52 song. The minute it starts, you know the music, you know the sound. When you hear Fred Schneider and Kate Pearson and Cindy Wilson, you know a B-52 song. Howard Jones. Howard Jones became famous for a song called New Song, which was his first single. That seemed to happen a lot with the new wave folks. But he, again, has a catalog of provocative, thoughtful, interesting songs. I got to see him for the first time a couple of years ago. He was on tour with Culture Club. So when I saw Culture Club the first time, I saw Howard Jones for the first time. At 69, he still sounds amazing. He still puts on a hell of a show. So if you're interested in that synthesizer era of new wave music, Howard Jones, hands down, is one of the best people to listen to get a sense of what that was like. And the last band I'll put on this list is, they started out as Yazoo and became Yaz. They were a duo which featured the singer Alison Moyet. Love Resurrection, Invisible. Their big album is Upstairs at Eric's. So if you listen to Upstairs at Eric's, you get a really cool overview of who they were and what they were about. So those are just some of the bands from that era that I really loved and really got into. Like I said, for me, music has always been a touchstone. It has always been a place I can go, either in my head or put it on and listen to it, and be taken somewhere different. If I'm in a bad mood, if I'm in a good mood, if I feel like dancing, if I feel like crying. I like so many different kinds of music that I've got something to pull out from each of those places. And I cannot imagine my life without listening to music in its produced form, and also going to live shows and listening to music in its raw form. Those are equally important to me, and over the years I've gotten into different types of music and different things. One of the things I know now is that every generation feels like their music was the best and that whatever modern music is sucks. My parents felt very strongly that the Motown era of music was the absolute best, and that what I listened to in the 80s was stuff that was terrible and that they just didn't get. I feel like that to a point with modern music. Do I feel like the 80s era of music was the best? I do, because that's when I grew up, and there was such a diverse universe of music. There was something for everyone. I don't hate modern music, but do I feel like a lot of it sounds the same? I do. I honestly do. In the 80s, I could distinguish people's voices very clearly. I knew what Boy George sounded like. I knew what Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys sounded like. I knew what Simon Le Bon from Duran Duran sounded like. So when I heard a song and I heard the singer, I immediately knew who the singer was. Now, when I listen to the radio, I'm like, didn't I just hear this song? Who's this? Wait, what's this person's name? So I feel like that. I'm sure this generation of kids looks back at the music I think is great and is like, what is this? This is what you listen to? I feel kind of bad for their parents, because I'm sure a lot of that goes on now, just like it went on when I was a teenager. But for people who love music, whatever the genre, whatever the age, whatever the decade, we will always love what we grew attached to, what we grew up with, what made us feel. And that's the biggest thing I know now about music is, regardless of what you're trying to feel, music's going to get you there. If you're working through sadness, if you're working through anger, if you're joyful, if you're happy, there is something you can hear that will either place you firmly in that place or take you out of it and take you to a different place. And I think that's the best thing about music. That is our episode for today. I hope you enjoyed these two episodes, I Love Music Parts 1 and 2. Next week, we will continue with our musical theme, but on a totally different subject. Next week, I'm going to talk about 25 of my all-time favorite songs. And trust me, getting down to 25 was a lot more than a notion. But I did get there, and so we're going to talk about that next week. I want to thank everybody for joining me for this episode. You can get this podcast, What I Know Now, anywhere you get your podcast: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon. Anywhere you get your podcast, you can get this podcast. On YouTube, if you'd like to see me as well as listen to me, you can go to youtube.com, type in my handle, Brick City Brown Chick. It will take you to my page, and all 20 episodes as of now are on that page. So you can dive into other topics I've talked about, including dealing with grief, colorism, growing up in the 80s, being a Gen Xer. So there's a bunch of different topics. People have asked me how I pick these topics. Whatever the mood is that strikes me for that week, that's what the topic is. So that's why there's such a varied list. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.